Hello and welcome. I am Sir Shudder. Before we begin, if you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe and hit the notifications icon to see when I've done another video. Today's video is about Gary Leon Ridgway, the Greenriver killer. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. When 54-year-old Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty in November 2003 to the murder of 48 prostitutes in Washington state in the 1980s, and as a result of his plea was spared the death penalty, the media lamented that there was nothing new to learn about serial killers from Ridgway, even though he now holds the record in the United States for killing the most victims and perhaps for evading authorities the longest. Ridgway seems to have eluded the kind of frenzied press coverage that serial homicide cases frequently attract. Ridgway was so typical, and his victims as street prostitutes held in such low self-esteem in society that even the remarkable number of deaths did not evoke more than mild routine press coverage outside the Washington state area. Indeed, Ridgway does represent everything typically known about serial killers. Born in 1949, he is the middle child of 3 sons who grew up in a working class neighborhood south of Seattle. His mother was reportedly highly domineering over the sons and her husband. According to one of Ridgway's former wives, she once broke a dinner plate over the father's head. As a child, Ridgway was a slow learner, failed twice in school, committed acts of arson, suffocated a cat, and paid a little girl to allow him to molest her. And as a teenager, he nearly stabbed to death a 6-year-old boy for no apparent reason. He was married 3 times. His first wife claims that their marriage failed because his mother dominated him. She described him, however, as socially and sexually normal. When arrested, Ridgway was steadily employed as a $21 an hour truck painter at the same place he began working after graduating high school 32 years earlier. His fellow workers remembered him as a gregarious and pleasant fellow worker and would socialize with him after work. Some of the women he supervised recalled that he was a patient instructor who never yelled at them. He owned a $200,000 house and a son, walked his dog, was friendly with his neighbours, went to church and held garage sales, sold Amway products. He had friends and read the Bible avidly, and for a while he proselytized door to door, calling on his neighbours to come closer to God. He also strangled at least 48 prostitutes, dumped them in wooded areas in what he called clusters, and would return routinely to have sex with the corpses. His second wife remembers him as a loner, obsessed with anal and oral sex. Both his second and third wives recalled he used to like having sex out near those where some of his victims were dumped. He killed most of his victims in a 2-year span between 1982 and 1984. He carefully deposited cigarette butts and chewing gum belonging to others at the crime scenes and body dumps to mislead police. He did not smoke or chew gum. He trimmed the victims' fingernails in case there was evidence lodged under them. He dropped advertising leaflets around the body of the one victim, hoping to mislead investigators, and transported the skeletal remains of 2 victims in the trunk of his car. Another state to another state while on a camping trip with his son. Ridgway confessed that he had placed a mound of sausage, trout, and wine bottle on one victim's body, creating a Last Supper scenario in order to deliberately confuse the police. In police terminology, Ridgway's attempts to give a false meaning to the crime scenes is called staging. Ridgway became a suspect in 1984 when police caught him soliciting prostitutes. His co-workers often kidded about it behind his back, calling him the Greenriver Gary, and joking that the initials of his name were the same as the Green River. As soon as he became a suspect, Ridgway appeared to almost cease committing murders. He confessed to one in 1986, one in 1988, and another in 1998. Police suspect, however, that he may have committed another 20 murders in other jurisdictions. Only advances in DNA technology led to Ridgway's arrest in 2001, nearly 20 years after most of the murders. Ridgway explained to the police that he chose to kill prostitutes because they would not be missed. Prostitutes were the easiest. I went from having sex with them to just plain killing them. The young ones stood out more when they talked, when they were dying. According to his plea bargain statement, I picked prostitutes as my victims because I hate prostitutes and I did not want to pay them for sex. I also picked prostitutes as victims because they were easy to pick up without being noticed. I knew they would not be reported missing right away and might never be reported missing. I picked prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without getting caught. By now, Ridgway is almost indistinguishable from other serial prostitute killers. Just like Richard Cottingham, Ridgway was steadily employed and had a wife, a house, and children, just like 50-year-old Robert Yates, who had 5 children, a wife, a house, and a mortgage. Like Ridgway, Yates quoted biblical scriptures as he murdered 13 women in the Spokane region. Although many of them were failed relationships, the failures were often no more extraordinary than the typical divorce. Cottingham, for example, had separated from his wife, but had a relationship with a girlfriend until the day he was arrested. She described him as entirely normal, even though he did take her several times to the same Quality Inn in New Jersey where he murdered 2 of his victims, was arrested torturing his last. William Lester Suff, 13 prostitute murders, and Arthur Shawcross, 11 victims, were in long-term relationships when they committed their murders. Ridgway represents truly everything we know about serial killers today, everything and nothing at the same time, because the answer to the main question, why, still eludes us. Early life. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah, the second of Mary and Thomas Ridgway's 3 sons. His home life was somewhat troubled. Relatives had described his mother as domineering and have said that while young, he witnessed more than one violent argument between his parents. His father was a bus driver who would often complain about the presence of sex workers. Ridgway had a bedwetting problem until he was 13, and his mother would wash his genitals after every episode. He would later tell defense psychologists that as an adolescent he had conflicting feelings of anger and sexual attraction towards his mother and fantasized about killing her. Ridgway was dyslexic and was held back a year in high school. When he was 16, he stabbed a 6-year-old boy who survived the attack. Ridgway had led the boy into the woods and then stabbed him through the ribs into his liver. Ridgway's IQ was recorded as being in the low 80s. Adult life. Ridgway graduated from Tyee High School in 1969 and married his 19-year-old high school girlfriend, Claudia Craig. He joined the US Navy and was sent to Vietnam, where he served on board a supply ship and saw combat. During this time in the military, Ridgway had frequent sexual intercourse with sex workers and contracted gonorrhea. Although angered by this, he continued his activity without protection. Their marriage ended within a year. When questioned about Ridgway after his arrest, friends and family described him as being friendly but strange. His first 2 marriages resulted in divorce because of infidelities by both partners. His second wife, Marcia Winslow, claimed that he had placed her in a chokehold. He had become religious during his second marriage, proselytizing door to door, reading the Bible aloud at work and at home, and insisting that his wife follow the strict teachings of their pastor. Ridgway would also frequently cry after sermons reading the Bible. Despite his beliefs, Ridgway continued to solicit the services of sex workers and wanted his wife to participate in sex in public and inappropriate places, sometimes even in areas where his victims' bodies were later discovered. According to women in his life, Ridgway had an insatiable sexual appetite. His 3 ex-wives and several ex-girlfriends reported that he demanded sex from them several times in a day. Often he would want to have sex in a public area or in the woods. Ridgway himself admitted to having a fixation with sex workers, with whom he had a love-hate relationship. He frequently complained about their presence in his neighborhood, but he also took advantage of their services regularly. Some have speculated that Ridgway was torn between his lusts and his staunch religious beliefs. With his second wife Marcia, Ridgway had a son, Matthew. Murders. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Ridgway is believed to have murdered at least 71 teenage girls and women near Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. In court statements, Ridgway later reported that he had killed so many that he lost count. A majority of the murders occurred between 1982 and 1984. The victims were believed to be either sex workers or runaways from whom he picked up along Pacific Highway South. Ridgway sometimes showed the women a picture of his son to trick them into trusting him. They would engage in sexual activity, and after minutes of intercourse from behind, Ridgway would wrap his forearm around their necks, the front of their necks, and use the other arm to pull back as tightly as he could, strangling them. He killed most victims in his home, his truck, or a secluded area. Most of their bodies were dumped in wooded areas around the Greenriver Seattle-Tacoma International Airport and other dump sites within South King County. There were also 2 confirmed and other 2 suspected victims found in Portland, Oregon area. The bodies were often left in clusters, sometimes posed, usually nude. He would sometimes return to the victims' bodies and have sexual intercourse with them. Ridgway later explained that he did not find necrophilia more sexually satisfying, but having sex with the deceased reduced his need to obtain a living victim and thus limited his exposure to being caught. Because most of the bodies were not discovered until only the skeletons remained, 3 victims are still unidentified. Ridgway occasionally contaminated the dump sites with gum, cigarettes, and written materials belonging to others, and he even transported a few victims' remains across state into Oregon to confuse the police. In the early 1980s, the King County Sheriff Office formed the Greenriver Task Force to investigate the murders. The task force members included Robert Capel and Dave Reichert, who periodically interviewed and incarcerated serial killer Ted Bundy in 1984. Bundy offered his opinions on the psychology, motivations, and behavior of the killer. He suggested the killer was revisiting the dump sites to have sex with the victims, which turned out to be true. And if police found a fresh grave, they should stake it out and wait for him to come back. Also contributing to this investigation was Johnny Douglas, who developed a profile of the suspect. Ridgway was arrested in 1982 and 2001, charges related to prostitution. He became a suspect in the Greenriver killings in 1983. In 1984, Ridgway passed a polygraph test. On April 7th, 1987, police took hair and saliva samples from Ridgway. Around 1985, Ridgway began dating Judith Mawson, who became his third wife in 1988. Mawson claimed in a 2010 television interview that when she moved into his house while they were dating, there was no carpet. Detectives later told her he had probably wrapped a body in the carpet. In the same interview, she described how he would leave for work early in the morning some days, ostensibly for the overtime pay. Mawson speculated that he must have committed some of the murders while supposedly working these early morning shifts. She claimed that she had not suspected Ridgway's crimes before she was contacted by authorities in 1987, and had even heard of the Greenriver killer before that time because she had not watched the news. Author Penny Moorhead interviewed Ridgway in prison, and he said while he was in a relationship with Mawson, his kill rate went down and that he truly loved her. Of his 49 known victims, only 3 were killed after he married Mawson. Mawson told a local television reporter, "I feel I have saved lives by being his wife and making him happy." The samples collected in 1987 were later subjected to DNA analysis, providing evidence for his arrest warrant. On November 30, 2001, Ridgway was at the Kenworth truck factory where he worked as a spray painter. When police arrived to arrest him, Ridgway was arrested on suspicion of murdering 4 women nearly 20 years earlier. After first being identified as a potential suspect when DNA evidence conclusively linked semen left the victims to the saliva swab taken by the police, the 4 victims named in the original indictment were Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen. 3 more victims, Wendy Cofield, Deborah Bonner, and Deborah Estes, were added to the indictment after forensic scientists identified microscopic spray paint spheres as a specific brand and composition of paint used at the Kenworth factory during the specific time frame when these victims were killed. The plea bargaining confession sentencing. Early in August 2003, Seattle Television News reported that Ridgway had been moved from a maximum security cell at King County Jail to an Airway Heights minimum medium security level tank. Other news reports stated that his lawyers, led by Anthony Savage, were closing a plea bargain that would spare him the death penalty in return for his confessions to a number of the Greenriver murders. On November 5, 2003, Ridgway entered a guilty plea to 48 charges of aggravated first-degree murder. As part of the plea bargain agreed to in June, that would spare him execution in exchange for his cooperation in locating the remains of his victims and providing other details in his statement accompanying his guilty plea. Ridgway explained that he had killed all of his victims inside King County, Washington, and that he transported and dumped the remains of 2 women near Portland to confuse the police. Deputy Prosecutor Jeffrey Baird noted in court that the deal contained the names of 41 victims who would not be subject to State vs. Ridgway. If it were not for the plea agreement, King County Prosecutor and Attorney Norm Maleng explained his decision to make the deal, we would not have gone forward with 7 counts, but that is all we could have ever hoped to solve. At the end of that trial, whatever the outcome, there would have been lingering doubts about the rest of these crimes. This agreement was the avenue to the truth, and in the end, the search for the truth is still why we have a criminal justice system. Gary Ridgway does not deserve our mercy. He does not deserve to live. The mercy provided by today's resolution is directed not at Ridgway, but towards the families who have suffered so much. On December the 18th, 2003, King County Superior Court Judge Richard Jones sentenced Ridgway to 48 life sentences, with no possibility of parole, and 1 life sentence to be served consecutively. He was also sentenced to an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence for each of the 48 victims, adding to 480 years to his 48 life sentences. Ridgway led prosecutors to 3 bodies in 2003. On August 16th of the year, the remains of a 16-year-old girl found near Enumclaw, Washington, 40 feet from State Route 410, were pronounced as belonged to Pammy Annette Avent, who had been believed to be a victim of the Greenriver killer. The remains of Mary Mulver and April Buttman were found in September 2003. On November 23, 2005, the Associated Press reported that a weekend hiker found the skull of one of the 48 women Ridgway admitted to murdering in 2003. Plea bargain with King County prosecutors. The skull of another victim, Tracy Winston, who was 19 when she disappeared from Northgate Mall on September 12, 1983, was found on November 20th, 2005 by a man hiking in the woodland area near the Highway 18 near Issaquah, southeast of Seattle. Ridgway confessed to more confirmed murders than any other American serial killer of a period of 5 months of police and prosecutor interviews. He confessed to 48 murders, 42 of which were on the police's list of probable Greenriver victims. On February 9, 2004, county prosecutors began to release the videotape records of Ridgway's confessions. In one taped interview, he initially told investigators that he was responsible for the deaths of 65 women. In another taped interview with Reichert on December 31st, 2003, Ridgway claimed to have murdered 71 victims and confessed to having had sex with them before killing them, a detail which he did not reveal until after this sentencing. In his confession, he acknowledged that he targeted prostitutes because they were easy to pick up and that he hated most of them. He confessed that he had sex with his victims' bodies after he murdered them, but claimed he began burying the later victims so that he could resist the urge to commit necrophilia. If you want a list of his confirmed victims, it is listed on Wikipedia. There are 49 victims confirmed on Wikipedia. As for the other ones, well, they're not declared. But that concludes my information on the Greenriver killer. Did you enjoy that? If you did, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe and hit the notifications icon so you can see when I've done another video. And
I want you to tell all your friends about me.
until next time, I am Sir Shudder. See you soon. Be safe, be cool.